guys, welcome back to another episode of the Zapata Brand Boxing Podcast, brought to you by Ringside, ringside.com/podcast. Get your 40% off selected items. Kevin Iole from KevinIole.com joins us on the podcast. Lots of stuff happening in MMA and boxing, but let's go right to it first with MMA. UFC settles a $335 million lawsuit, antitrust kind of civil lawsuit. I mean, it was more of a class action lawsuit.
Yeah.
And they settled it for $335 million. In my opinion, UFC came out kind of ahead on this. If you can, go to the details of what you know. You've been speaking to lawyers for the last few days.
Yeah, lawyers and economists. So it's been interesting. I am not a lawyer, nor am I an economist. So I'm going to do the best I can. But in 2014, a group of fighters sued the UFC, claiming violations of federal antitrust laws. And basically, as I understand it, their ultimate goal was to create more competition and to therefore be able to get better contracts when they got into free agency, right? And so they wanted to. One of their aims was to change UFC contracts, what the terms in the contracts were. Well, after nearly 10 years, they filed in late 2014, so we're in early 2024, not quite 10 years, they finally settled and they got no changes. So that was the biggest loss, George, no change in the contract. So the UFC is going to do business the way they had always done business. Nothing is going to change. And I think when I look at the amount of money, the fighters were asking, there were two separate lawsuits, one that went from 2010 to about 2017, and then another one that started 2017 that covered the period of up to about 2021.
Right.
And those two lawsuits were both settled in this one settlement for $335 million. And of course, the one thing we know right off the top, the lawyers are going to get, a large part of that money. I think probably my guess is going to be 30% of that $335 million is going to go to the lawyers that represented the plaintiffs in this action. So the fighters will separate the rest of that money. So, it's hard to see it as anything but the cost of doing business for the UFC, but a very big win for the UFC. The UFC's stock price rose significantly. They're going to be able to pay this over time. It's tax deductible. Think about that. Tax deductible. So the fighters, did not come out the way they had hoped. And, it's sad. I mean, I am not an antitrust lawyer, and so I don't know what constitutes an antitrust violation and doesn't. But obviously the fighters, I think, were looking at this and seeing this was going to go on at least another 5 years. The trial was scheduled to start in April. And in the best case scenario for the fighters, they would have won at trial. The UFC would have appealed. And you were going to probably be looking at 5 years of appeals and then maybe to the Supreme Court, maybe as long as 10 years. And I think the fighters decided to cut their losses, George, and take what they could get at this point.
Here's the caveat here. Again, I am a proponent for fighters getting as much pay as they want, but I'm also a capitalist. So I do get both sides. The thing I don't want to hear any more unions and stuff like that from the fighters, because if the fighters aren't on the forefront of a united front, they have no leg to stand on. I did a little bit of a, Georgie Bagels math here. If they were to pay this out, because they're going to take 33 1/3, that's what I think the thing would be. 33 1/3, the lawyers take off the top. That leaves about $221 million left. Distributed over about 1,300 fighters that were in there, about 1,100 fighters. If they pay that out over a 5-year period, just a 5-year period, not everyone's going to get the same. We're just going to take the average. It's $36,000 a fighter. Or every year for 5 years. That is a huge win. And then the fact that this is it. This is over now. That's over. You're not coming back. Right. You had your one shot. There has to be a martyr for them. Unfortunately, that's the only way Major League Baseball got free agency. That's the only way the NFL got free agency. So if you want to have a legitimate sporting league, they do. I think they do. They run it like a business, but it is a league. They have a guy on top that does. You have to have a martyr. There's no way this is coming back around. I don't want to hear it. I mean, I know it seems like I'm being a little harsh on the fighters' end, but you need someone to do it. And most of the fighters probably are broke.
Well, here's one of the problems that I think, like I've always been for labor in all these professional sports. The NFL, you root for the players to win. Major League Baseball's union is great, right? But the fighters are different because it's an individual sport, right? So in tennis and golf, you might want to compare it to them, and you see what happened with Liv when competition. Yep. And the purses in golf went up. The PGA Tour suddenly all of a sudden increased all these purses, so that they would keep, and made it in events that the big stars would want to play in. But I don't think they're comparable because the fighters aren't going for prize money. They are negotiating contracts for how much they get. But here's the difference between the NBA, let's say the big four team sports, the NBA, the NHL, the NFL, and Major League Baseball, when you compare them to fighters, whether it be MMA fighters or boxers. No matter how good Shohei Ohtani is, he cannot win the World Series for the Dodgers by himself. You're not going to win the World Series with Shohei Ohtani only. You're not going to win the Super Bowl with Patrick Mahomes only. He's so damn good you can get close, but But the problem is in the fighters that there's disparate interests, right? So if you are Conor McGregor and you're sitting there, do you really care? And do you want to go out and do you want to walk the picket line against the UFC and turn down 12, 15, 18, whatever, how many $1 million he's making in these fights and say, I don't want to fight anymore until you help somebody who's at the beginning, who's at the 12 and 12, who's making 12 to show and 12 to win. They don't have that incentive, but in baseball they do because they're teammates and you need your teammates. Patrick Mahomes needs his offensive line. He needs his receivers, all that type of thing. In baseball, Shohei Ohtani, needs other players around him in order for them to be able to win. Otherwise they become the Pittsburgh Pirates, right? Take a little shot at my Pirates. But yeah. I think that's the difference. And so you don't have common interests among the fighters where you have common interest among the athletes in the team sports.
Yeah, Shohei Ohtani needs a new interpreter. I think that's what he's got to do. He's got something else he's dealing with right now. I mean, someone's taking $4 million out of your bank. That's another story. But
I wish I had it for him to steal it. That's I guess that's my.
It's an incredible story. When I heard that, I was like, "What are you writing checks out to a gambling casino, an illegal one to boot?" So he's got some issues there. That's a whole nother topic there. But again, I think you're right in a sense that individual sports is way different than the team sport. This was a huge blow to any individualized 1099 employee that is going to look to somehow modernize that boxing MMA thing. The Ali Act kind of was destroyed right here to go into MMA. I think that's kind of not going to happen. I don't think there's a chance of that happening. But
no, and a lot of people, George, let me just say this real quick. A lot of people, especially on the MMA side, who don't have experience in boxing, they hail the Ali Act as something that would change MMA. Look at how screwed up boxing is. It's doing very little for boxing, right? It's not. Yeah, it's not serving the intended purpose, right? I mean, the Ali Act is mainly notification. So basically, when you sign a contract, the promoter, is getting Eddie Hearn is getting money from DAZN, or Oscar De La Hoya is getting money from DAZN, or whatever the television entity is. They have to show all their sources of income. That's what they do. There's that notification on there. And I've covered a lot of cases on that. The Ali Act would not fundamentally have changed MMA. I think other federal rules might, be a new legislation, but certainly not the Ali Act.
Does this kind of put the nail in the coffin to that, where, you're not gonna move forward with it? This is the system that you guys have agreed to, and that's the way it kind of puts a nail in where Dana White now says, okay, this is the way it's going to be. Let's put this stuff to the side, knock off the little pest. Now we're going to move forward. Is that kind of where you feel it's going to go now?
I mean, it's hard for anybody now to come in as a new company and compete against the UFC, right? Because, with this case, going under, there's no contractual changes. And so the UFC is going to have the ability to control the market to a large degree for for as long as they want to do. So even if you're a well-funded, person, and you come in and you have all these great plans, it's going to be really hard to get to where the UFC is, because, hey, look, and give the UFC credit for one thing. I mean, for they have done good business, right? They have been smart. I'm not talking about in terms of the salaries. I'm talking about in the way they've built their own business, right? And they built, they've done better PR than other people. They've done better in terms of marketing than other people. They've done better in terms of sponsorships and ticket sales and all these other things that have nothing to do with the salaries they're paying the fighters, right?
Right.
And they've really built up. And we know the UFC doesn't have all the best fighters. They have. My take is that UFC at any given time has 65 to 75% of the world's best fighters, right? But there's a lot of good fighters out there that are not in the UFC. But those fighters aren't marketed as well, and they aren't brought to the public's attention as well often as they are when when they're in the UFC. And that's the big difference.
Let me ask you a question, and I think you would know the answer to this, or you'd have more insight than I would. Okay, so they are classified as 1099 employees.
Yeah, independent contractors. Yep.
Independent contractors. And I also compare that to now were bought by TKO, WWE. They're independent contractors. Okay. Why cannot a guy who's signed to UFC as an independent contractor jump over to Bellator or WWE, jump over to AEW? I don't understand that, because if
you're signing a contract with them and saying, I'm going to fight, for this many, X number of fights, right? So that's what your contract, or this, usually the contracts have two things. We will offer you X number of fights over X number of months, right? So, we'll offer you 4 fights over a 2-year period, or 8 fights over a 3-year period, or whatever the case may be. They lock those fighters, those fighters in. And the other, the other thing that's created out of this, one of the things that, is that the UFC is perceived to be the major league, right? So the UFC is the NFL, or the UFC is the NBA of fighting, right?
Right.
And so, do you want to go to Bellator? Occasionally there might be a fighter that leaves the UFC and goes to the PFL or goes to Bellator and actually makes more money. Shane Burgos pops to mind, right? The UFC didn't sign him a few years ago. He fought on Long Island. He's from that area, had a big crowd of people there cheering him on. He ends up signing afterwards for a really large contract with the PFL. Now, he left the UFC, but I think he was doing it because he realized, hey, I'm never going to be a champion in the UFC, right? He was a good, solid, middle of the top 10, like maybe number 6 to 15 type fighter, right? He was never going to get in that top point where he's going to make the really big money. The fighters who make the big money in the UFCs undoubtedly are the champions. And then secondly, the ones that are getting close to the championship, right? Those are the ones who make the most money. And so I think Burgos looked at it and said, well, hey, look, I'm not going to get to that point. I'm not going to win the UFC, featherweight championship. I'm sitting here and I can take this big amount of money from the PFL and I might be able to win their $1 million tournament. And if I win the $1 million tournament, I get that, I get that as well. That gives me more money than I'm going to make in the UFC. But now he's not going to be able to get that really big money in the UFC if he would happen to win the championship and then go on and become a star.
It was always just a gray area to me, only because I look at it as, if they classify you as 1099 or a W-2, if you're 1099, I always thought, and if I had hired a plumber here to do my work, I couldn't tell him, hey, you got to wear this, you got to wear that, you got to be here at this time to do this job. They're jumping job to job. It is a little different, I get it, but the classification always got me. It was always gray area to me.
But again, we're getting into things that neither you or I are expert in. But
no,
I think it's this, right? You're hiring a plumber. You're hiring a plumbing company. Even if it's one plumber, that plumber has his own company that is doing business, right? Or if you hire a company that has 20 plumbers, right? You are hiring that company, and they are sending that specific plumber to you. Whereas the UFC is the plumbing company, and they are hiring the plumbers. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. The more so, yeah. I just was always curious about it because I never knew why people didn't jump all over. And I guess boxing totally different too. Beside that, what
Boxing,
did
boxing fighters are independent contractors and they sign with a promoter.
promoter? Yes.
Canelo is a great example. Canelo showing how, and I wrote this a long time ago. Canelo is using the system to his advantage. Instead, a lot of people want to get in there, and maybe it's smart when you're not a superstar or you're not going to be a superstar like Canelo.
Mhm.
Get that security and have an 8-fight contract, and you're going to make X number
Right.
for all your fights. But Canelo sits there and he signs short-term deals, and he's able to move from promoter to promoter to promoter because you know what happens, George. Like, look at this. We don't know what in 2 years. We don't know what promoter's going to have the best, featherweights. We don't know what promoter's going to have the best middleweights.
Mhm.
We don't know what promoter's going to have the best light heavyweights. So
Right.
Canelo signs a short-term deal. He finishes. Now he looks and he says, "Oh, I think Matchroom has the best fighters in my category," or I think. Well, it wouldn't be gold. He wouldn't go to Golden Boy, but I think Top Rank has the best, or the PBC has the best, and whoever. That's what he does, and so he's using the system the way it should be used.
Now, you had an interview up for KevinIole.com with an economist. What was his perception about economically what this is going to, how it impacts UFC? You talked about the tax cuts, tax breaks that they get. What is it going to do for them long term?
Well, I think this enables them to further solidify their position. I think that's what really is the thing here. They are now they are the market leader. They're the unquestioned market leader, and they're going to solidify their position as the market leader as a result of this. If their contracts were forced to be changed in any substantial, significant way, there might have been an ability for somebody else, for a competitor, to come in and push them and challenge them. But right now, they are going to be able to keep the contracts the way they are. They're going to be able to keep the fighters on a longer term basis. Years ago, and I don't know if this is totally analogous, but when Oscar De La Hoya was a fighter, he sued Top Rank. He signed with Top Rank out of the Olympics, and he fought for Top Rank for roughly 8-10 years, and then he sued them. And basically what he said was the contract was onerous and it was too long. And he sued them in California, and the state of California agreed with him. And
Okay.
he was able to get out, and that ultimately led to the formation of Golden Boy in a roundabout way. But that was the first step in what led to Golden Boy Promotions being formed, and he was able to get out of that and start promoting his own fights. But now the UFC doesn't have to worry about that because their contracts are not, at a federal level. They've been, exonerated, I guess is the word to use, right?
Have I know you released the statement that UFC had. Has Dana White had any word directly from him on
I haven't spoken to Dana White in a while, so not even text this week. So, but they weren't making any of their executives available to speak.
Okay.
And I think obviously for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, I think it'll be interesting when Dana speaks after Judge Boulware. Judge Richard Boulware has to ratify and approve the settlement. And so if he does not approve it, then, I'm not sure exactly what happens. I don't know if they go back to talks again and fix what he doesn't like. But I mean, it's expected, since both sides agreed, that the judge will ratify. But it's not a rubber stamp. He doesn't have to ratify it. But once he approves the settlement, and then the pressure is off Dana White or any of the fighters, right? On both sides, they can talk and they can say what they think. And so I think you'll hear more come out later after the settlement is approved by the judge.
Well, let's switch gears. This coming weekend, or next weekend, actually, we're on Friday, 1 week from tomorrow, March 30th, ppv.com, which you were in the chat there. This week, this time you will not. Jim Lampley and Lance Pugmire will be there. We have Tszyu coming in with a late replacement, Sebastian Fundora. In my opinion, better fight.
Yeah.
I think it's a better fight, to be honest with you. Well, what do you think about it?
I think unfortunate for Keith Thurman that, he suffered the biceps injury. I saw he posted a radiologist report, and it showed that the bicep was pulled right off the tendon. So he needs to undergo surgery. That's a pretty significant injury. And
I had that.
Yeah. So,
they have to attach that. They have two screws that go too. I had the same exact injury he had. And it's a long time. This at 30 some, it's
he's 35 years old, hasn't fought since 2022. He's fought one time in 5 years. You know, you got to think that this may be the end, unfortunately, for Keith Thurman, who is a good guy, a really good fighter. And I feel for Keith Thurman. But I think from a stylistic standpoint, Fundora might make a better match. Now, I think Thurman was going to be more competitive with Tszyu than I think Fundora will be. But my big issue here in this is, why in the hell is this a title fight? Like,
I was going to say that.
Sebastian Fundora got knocked cold by Brian Mendoza in his last fight, took the count of 10, and now he's not. He is fighting for a unified championship. And in my mind, and I think in a lot of people's mind, unified champions are a little bit higher. They have higher stature than other fighters. And Fundora, who I have nothing against, I like Sebastian and I like his sister Gabby. They're both good people and they're good fighters. And I have rooted for Sebastian in his career because of what a good kid he is. But it's just not right. Why are the WBO and the WBC sanction this as a championship fight? It's a good fight. It doesn't need to be a title fight.
Well, Sebastian was on the receiving end of knockout of the year 2023. Only in boxing does this happen. You get a knockout loss, a fight of the year, knockout of the year, and then come back in your next fight and get a unification bout against a guy who would beat the guy that knocked you out. What I think's happening though, and I think you're going to see this more often, similar to what UFC does. They put guys on the undercard that they can kind of slip in just in case.
Yes, no, that's really smart to do. And you know, I have no problem. Like, if they would have stopped and said, "Hey, this is the main event: Fundora versus Tszyu, 12-round non-title fight." Great job. You know, I love it. You saved the show. You saved the card for the people who love boxing, who we're looking forward to seeing, you know, Wally Romero and Isak Cruz, or, you know, some of the other fights. I love it. Bohacic's now going to fight Brian Mendoza. So God bless him for doing that. Thank you, Tom Brown, promoter Tom Brown, for saving it. Thank you, Al Heyman, for I sound like a fighter there, for saving that. So thank you, Amazon Prime, for going forward. I think it's terrific, right? But why is this a title fight? And I shouldn't care that much, right? But there's two things that I want to bring up, George. Number one, there's another WBC super welterweight title fight card. How ridiculous can we be? We have the vacant WBC super welterweight title fight being contested in the main event. But an hour earlier or 2 hours earlier, Bohacic and Mendoza are fighting for the interim WBC title. And the reason I don't like this is it confuses the public. Right. You and I are involved in boxing, and we understand, and you have this convoluted boxing logic you have to follow. But it's hard for the average public. They want to know, who was the champion? Who did you beat to win the championship? And then if they say George beat Kevin, okay, he beat Kevin, he's the champion. All of a sudden, Kevin shouldn't be champion after George beat Kevin, right? That's not how it works. And this is what these goofy sanctioning bodies are doing. And, you know, I want to say this. I like both Paco Valcarcel, who is the president of the WBO. I've played golf with Paco a number of times. Really good guy. Mauricio Suleiman is the president of the WBC, also a good guy, and I think has a good heart. Mauricio Suleiman does a lot of good charitable work, right? I have a lot of really good things to say about Mauricio Suleiman. But the way he handles these titles is the one thing I disagree with him on. I respect Mauricio Suleiman a lot, and I think Mauricio is the one that deserves more of the heat here than Paco, because Paco, Tim Tszyu is his champion, and Correct. He was, you know, and he was putting that title up, and the promoters made that fight. But the WBC is putting two super welterweight title fights on the line on the same show. I mean, come on.
Now, could this be for the sanctioning fees?
Oh, of course. No, that's how that. That's
I mean, so they wouldn't want to be out of the pot. Just to be honest with you, they're not going to want to be out of the pot.
But don't you say, George? Don't you say, if you're them, a rising tide lifts all boats? And you know, as much as we love boxing, it's down here, right? And if boxing just was up here, if they just managed the bullshit better, right? If they manage the way the rankings are, and if they manage the way that, don't change too much fundamentally, just do the rankings fairly, do the championship, sanction the championship fights fairly and even-handedly, the sport would be better off. And there would be more money, not less. But it's like the pie gets smaller all the time because of these crazy decisions.
It's hard to manage. It's like, herding stray cats. It's hard to do, like nailing jelly to a tree or something. It's hard to do in boxing.
Eating soup with a fork is my favorite.
What's that?
Eating soup with a fork is my favorite.
Perfect. I mean, it's hard to do with boxing. It's very frustrating. The co-main event, Nat, I think is the people's main event in this one. Isaac Cruz, Rolly Romero. I love the fight. I loved it when it was first signed. I've kind of gone away from the gloves off exclusives that they were having there. I kind of got away from it because Isaac Cruz and Rolly Romero were the two that I wanted to see anyway. What do you think of that one? That looks like a firestorm coming.
I like that fight. It's interesting, and I think that this you could see a knockout coming either way in this fight. I could see, Cruz is going to be putting that pressure on, right? I think Romero's a little bit overrated, but he can punch, right? And I think that Cruz coming in, and if he walks into something, he's got to be concerned about that. But I think Cruz is a pretty smart fighter, and I think he's going to pressure intelligently. I would kind of lean toward Cruz. I haven't done a lot of breakdown of it yet, George. I'll spend more time on that during fight week. But my off the top of the head when the fight was announced, I kind of thought Cruz pressure was going to kind of wilt Romero a little bit. And I think you saw that in the Gervonta Davis fight. Now, Gervonta Davis hit so freaking hard that, he didn't have the chance to wilt him. He just put him to sleep right away. But I think the fight was starting to turn in Gervonta's favor, and then bingo, the lights got put out. But I like Cruz with his pressure in this fight.
And Isaac is a good defensive fighter, very technically. I mean, and when you watch that Gervonta Davis fight, some of the punches that Gervonta Davis normally would hit people with his fakes to the body, then right up with the uppercut, he was catching. Isaac Cruz was catching him. He was pretty sharp. The only thing I didn't like, I thought Isaac Cruz looked really heavy in between these two fights.
Yeah,
he's just real chunky. That's the only thing I didn't like. Still, great defensive fighter, great technical fighter, and he can punch. I definitely lean towards Isaac Cruz in this one. I think Rolly Romero is just a little too wide open, a little too wild. But as always, Kevin, you joined us here on the show at KevinIole.com. Where can they get a hold of you on your social media and on your website?
I am on Twitter at Kevin I, and I am on everything else on Instagram, Facebook at Kevin Iole, and of course my website. And we got, and you know what, I make the announcement here, we got new merch up, right? I got polo shirts now available for people in about 15 colors. So if you want to get a polo shirt with my logo on it, you can get that. And I also, and you talk about inventions are made out of necessity. Well, like in my case, merchandise goes out of necessity. I've been selling coffee cups with my logo on it. And it was a 15-ounce cup. And I went, what the hell is this? I want more coffee. So I got a bigger coffee cup, and I put the logo on both sides. And we got new coffee cups, too. So
you're becoming a marketer. You're becoming a marketer. I knew I'd get it out of you. At some point, I knew I'd turn you into a marketer. Unbelievable. But Kevin Iole
at George's Bagel Store and dunk it in your coffee. There you go.
This is a great collaboration here. This is great. George Bagel and Kevin Iole, KevinIole.com. Go there, get your merch right now. New merch on sale. Follow him on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. He's all over the place. As always, Kevin, you got the best stories of breaking news. I appreciate you coming on.
You got it, brother. Thank you.
Thanks for watching the Zapata Brand Podcast. Please subscribe to the podcast and listen where all podcasts are available.